Good morning and good afternoon or good evening also for folks. My name is Dean Amhouse and I'm the President and CEO of the Water Council. We're very pleased that you're joining us. I know that there are continuing to more people coming on to the webinar. So we'll be starting in a few minutes. But as a quick introduction, just of myself, again, with the Water Council. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization, we are based in Milwaukee, but really are a truly global organization. And we were founded almost 20 years ago. Time has gone by very quickly by two businesses that are in our community, A.O. Smith Corporation, and we've got one person who's with them who will be joining us on the webinar today. And then the other company was Badger Meter. Of course, we had a lot of other parties in Milwaukee that were helping create what's now become the Water Council. And we are a water technology cluster that focuses on both drinking water, wastewater, water quality, and quantity as well. Two principal platforms are around innovation as well as on water stewardship and helping businesses to look at their risks associated with water. So again, welcome to our webinar. We're going to get some insights from some our sort of resident insiders in DC. A lot has occurred even in the last less than 48 hours in Washington with the new administration. And I want to let everybody know that if you have a question, put it into the Q&A. You'll see that at the bottom of the box, and I'll be monitoring that, and Stacy will also be watching for that to be able to inject questions. So with that, let me start the program. Oh, and I forgot to acknowledge is that this webinar is brought to you in support with the U.S. Small Business Administration, but everything that is being stated here, all the opinions, conclusions, recommendations are those of the panelists and myself. These are not the views of the SBA at all. So with that, let me introduce to you our three panelists. And Josh and Tim have been with us in the past, and joining us is Jay Sulzmann, who works with Tim. He's got a whole other expertise, which I think will be lend a good to the conversation. So Josh, could you just a quick little intro about yourself and A.O. Smith?
Sure. Thanks, Dean, and good morning, everyone. Once again, we want to thank the Water Council for everything that it does, including these informative webinars and many other programs, and A.O. Smith's longstanding working relationship with the Council. Again, my name is Josh Greene. I am Corporate Vice President for Government, Regulatory, and Industry Affairs for the A.O. Smith Corporation at the parent level. I'm based in Washington, D.C., but of course, go all over the place in advocating and advancing the company's positions in front of international, federal, state, and local policymakers and regulators. I'm also very involved with the company's water and sustainability efforts, as well as representing the company in various industry associations, of which A.O. Smith is a member. I've been in this position for 9 years, having come out of the private practice of law, where I was an energy and environment regulatory and policy attorney here in Washington, D.C. for many years, of which I had the great pleasure to represent A.O. Smith. So I guess they gave me an offer I couldn't refuse. But when I was a much younger man, I did work in Congress in what seems to be a different era these days with my brother there, Tim Hannegan. And again, wonderful to be with you this morning and look forward to the dialogue.
Thanks very much, Josh. And I were amiss. I actually used to work in Washington, D.C. myself a long, long time ago, and I agree it was a very different time back in the 80s. Tim, let me introduce, or if you could introduce yourself. Again, you've joined us for several of these webinars and sessions over the years. So if you could do a little bit about your experience in your firm.
Absolutely, and it's great to virtually see everyone. Tim Hannegan, co-founder of HLP&R Advocacy. We've been in business a little over 13 years, bipartisan firm, Republicans and Democrats, and I'm the lead Democrat, and Jay on our team handles much of the Republican side of the aisle. I have had the honor and privilege of working with Josh and Dean for many, many years, representing A.O. Smith and the Water Council here in Washington, D.C. On all things, particularly all things water. They have done, particularly at the A.O. Smith and Water Council level, a tremendous job elevating water issues, innovation, et cetera. And as we enter this new phase and new administration, it will be an interesting dialogue on the path forward, and I look forward to it. In my previous life, before lobbying, I was at the U.S. General Accounting Office, which is a part of the U.S. Congress, involved in auditing federal agencies and their programs. So a little bit different, view into how the government works that hopefully as we move forward, that can lend a little bit of insight. And with that, let me turn it over to Jay to give a little bit of his background.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Jay Sulzmann, it's great to connect with y'all. I joined Tim here at HLP&R about, almost 5 years ago, although it does not feel like it's been 5 years because I had the good fortune to start right at the beginning of a global pandemic. So it feels like it's been maybe more like 2 or 3 years of real lobbying here, but I came off of 15 years on Capitol Hill, working for members of the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. So a lot of my background is in the healthcare, tax, trade issues that are under the jurisdiction of those committees, but spent my last few years in the Senate running the policy shop for former Senator Johnny Isakson from Georgia. So also have quite a bit of familiarity with water issues and a wide range of policy issues from my time in that office, and looking forward to the conversation here.
Perfect. Thanks, gentlemen. And I should say too, is that, from the panelists, we've got a variety of different points of view. We've got Republicans, Democrats, people that have worked in Congress, in the administrations, agencies, and so forth. So I think it's going to be a robust discussion. This is a pretty free-flowing conversation, as I've said, with them, the panelists before. Please interject, ask questions of yourselves, agree, disagree. This is a friendly conversation and discussion. So we're going to sort of talk about 4 or so different topics, is sort of what's the general state of what's going on, in DC. There's a lot of changes that have occurred, obviously, anytime when there's a new president, the White House, a lot of changes there, but certainly also within Congress. We'll talk about some policy issues, discussions around international engagement, around tariffs and trade as a whole. And then, surprisingly enough, we're already starting to think about the next election. And I always think, the day after the one election, the next one starts right away. So kind of give a little bit of crystal ball, like where are things looking for 2026 as well. So I'm going to start off with Josh, just to give you sort of a time. It's been literally less than 48 hours since President Trump was sworn into office. Congress has been working for a few weeks as well. Kind of what's the general mood going on in DC right now?
So thanks, Dean. And other than we're freezing in Washington, D.C., like other places around the country, certainly the mood, depending upon certainly what political lens you're looking through, is a little bit of doom and gloom, but a little also of joyous and renewal and some new activity moving forward. One of the things right out of the box, and certainly many of the participants on the webinar and my fellow panelists know all too well, is there's already been a flurry of activity with which most of us here, I guess, inside the bubble per se, certainly were anticipating, with President Trump coming in for a second term, knowing how the town works a little bit more from his first term, and certainly having people around him and working on the transition that were more knowledgeable about the inner workings of Washington. And so, we saw the pageantry somewhat of the executive order signings, and there was a lot. There's a lot in there to unpack across all sectors of the economy, including water and energy, in which we certainly have an interest. So there's a lot of digesting going on right now. Maybe that's the best way I can characterize it. Both, on Capitol Hill, certainly outside of Washington, the inner workings of Washington. There are a lot of personnel decisions that are being made at a pace, at a much more rapid pace than the first term. Federal agency memorandums have already gone out about some rescissions of workforce. We all know about the back to work, but having said that, I would come back to just overarching digestion of the EOs, and then getting a handle on where President Trump may want to go with a all Republican Congress, this trifecta that we have in Washington. And a lot of us on the outside are doing the same thing and having dialogues with members of the administration, as well as members of Congress and our own internal stakeholders as well.
When you mention EO, that means executive orders,
Yes,
things
sorry.
that you hearing about, and I think the whole notion of moving fast, and it sort of gets into the the next election, is that we really have a 2-year period of time. I mean, so they're going to try to move as quickly as possible on things. Tim, what's your what are you hearing from people within this the DC area?
Yeah, I would say Josh nailed it as far as particularly the overall context of what we're dealing with, particularly this week. A couple things I would kind of foot stomp. First, this is the second rodeo for the incoming Trump folks. So Josh is exactly right. They have a much better idea, regardless of what you think of the actions. They have a better idea of what they wanted to do. And so they were able to hit the ground running much faster than they did in the Trump first administration. Some key questions that as we digest, and I think that's exactly right, the entire corporate America is trying to digest the flurry of orders, executive orders that have come out. A key question, two key questions are, how far can the president of the United States go in executive orders, and when does he need Congress to act? Some of these things, particularly when it comes to spending money and other things, may need to have congressional action, and kind of where that line is part of that digestion, because that leads into what will Congress do to pick up the baton from what the president has just done with the flurry of executive actions. And I think that a big part of what the president has done, which this leads into water, is try and roll back as many of the initiatives that the Biden administration has done, particularly in the areas of diversity, equity, inclusion, potentially environment, sustainability, the ESG, landscape, and that begins to touch on the water initiatives of the last 4 years, potentially. We have to determine as part of Josh's digestion process exactly what can the president do. One of the orders talked about reversing a lot of the infrastructure spending that has passed over the last 4 years, and money's been going out the door. Can he do that? I mean, I think you asked some members of Congress that may take a different view. So I think that question, as these roll out, are the things that I'm looking at, and I think we all should look at, which tees up, what is Congress's role as we get into this.
Yeah, actually, and that's where I was going to go with Jay. You're the person who was most recent in Congress or working in Congress. So They have a role in all of this. Tim, you talked about the funding for the infrastructure. Those funds went into Democrat, districts as well as Republicans. And I've heard too, there's some Republicans that, hey, this is some really good things. We want to be able to keep that funding. But what are you hearing within Congress, both in the Senate and the House, their level of engagement of what they see, what's the kind of the general, mood going on there?
Well, I was thinking of all of the water puns that I could try to bring into this conversation, and the deluge of executive orders, and how members of Congress are drinking from a fire hose right now. I think Congress is really in the same position that Josh described of digesting a lot of this initial action. Republican members of Congress were briefed at a high level on the direction that the president was planning to go with these day one executive orders, but I think there was still a lot of detail that they found out at the same time that all the rest of us did. So, what does that what does the response look like to some of these executive orders on rescission of funds, other things that might infringe on traditional congressional prerogatives? I think on the Republican side, there is a lot of excitement about the trifecta and the opportunity to take policy in a new direction. I think there's also a lot of awareness that with the extremely thin margins, particularly in the House of Representatives, where Speaker Johnson is going to be down to a 217 to 215 majority after Congresswoman Stefanik gets confirmed to the UN. That's about as narrow as it can get. You lose one vote, and your bill fails. So there's a wide diversity of ideological views and priorities and tactical perspectives within the House Republican Conference, and getting all of those folks on the same page for anything that is close to a party line vote, it's going to be extremely challenging. So you see that reflected both in the conversations about this budget reconciliation process for border, energy, extending the tax cuts from 2017, but also in the looming issues on funding the government, which expires in mid-March, and raising the debt ceiling, which they will need to do likely sometime in the spring or early summer. Looks like those things are probably going to have to involve some level of bipartisan agreement, and that will be that will make some members of the Republican conference, particularly in the House, very unhappy. So,
yeah, in many ways, I mean, things are moving fast, but then, within Congress, things can slow down real quickly as well, and grind to, halt. And I think you make a good point about within the House, those margins are really brief, are small, and all you have to do is have a small coalition of folks on one side or the other that can sort of object to things. Sticking on reconciliation, Jay, if I could ask you, just for the people who are attending, very briefly, what is reconciliation? Because it sounds like this is for Congress, one of the first things that they're going to move forward on. What is it, and what's falling into that? And when it comes to, folks working in water, why does it matter, this whole reconciliation bill?
yeah, so Dean, it's a great question. So budget reconciliation is a process that Congress can use to pass certain legislation within very limited parameters. And the reason that it's important is because under the Budget Act of 1974, there's a fast track process in the Senate for consideration of a budget reconciliation bill. So we all know about the Senate filibuster. There's typically a 60 vote requirement to end a filibuster in the Senate, and thus to be able to move forward with any legislation. Republicans have 53 votes in the Senate, so they would need to pick up at least seven Democrats to get to that 60 vote threshold. So what do they do on issues that they can't pick up seven Democrats? That's where budget reconciliation comes in. Like I said, there are limited parameters around what you can put in a budget reconciliation bill. It has to be spending or revenues, items with a direct budgetary impact. That's kind of the easy test. The harder test is there's also a rule that the budget impact of a provision cannot be merely incidental to the policy impact. And so you've seen this play out in the past, for example, on issues like the minimum wage or immigration reform. You can make the argument that some of these policy changes would have an impact on federal spending or revenues, but the Senate parliamentarian is really the holder of the cards on what can and cannot be put in a reconciliation bill, and has ruled that those are examples of policies where the budgetary impact is merely incidental. Therefore, those things cannot be included in a reconciliation bill. I expect we will see the same story play out with some of the things that President Trump and Republicans in Congress want to put in budget reconciliation. They will likely not be able to. In terms of the process, you have to pass a budget resolution first that sets out the instructions for what the committees are going to put in the budget reconciliation bill. That budget resolution is very high level, but it includes numbers that are targets for the committees to meet. So, for example, we're going to reduce revenues by $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. That was the instruction in the budget that led to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. Settling on that number is the first thing that the House and Senate Republicans are going to have to get on the same page on. What are going to be the numbers for spending? What are going to be the numbers for revenue? You've seen a lot of conversation about, do we do two reconciliation bills or package everything together into one big bill? That's obviously closely, very, very much dependent on where the votes are. Do you think that putting everything together makes it harder for people to vote against a big package? Or are you worried that if you put everything together, that's going to drag the process down and you're not going to get that early win on something like border security that some Republicans would like to see? So that's kind of the political procedural conversation around budget reconciliation. In terms of why it matters to folks in the water business, I think there's a variety of potential impacts. Obviously, the tax code is going to be up for consideration pretty much in its entirety. You have all of the individual and small business provisions from the 2017 tax law are expiring at the end of this year. So Congress has to figure out, are we going to extend those? How long are we going to extend them? What additional policies are we potentially going to put in place to pay for them, which is where corporate tax changes could come into the conversation. There's debate about whether tariffs could potentially go into a budget reconciliation bill. I think that's fairly unlikely, but it is a way of raising revenue. And then the other bucket would be just all of the spending on energy, water, other types of programs that are of interest to Water Council members that could be considered for rescissions of spending or cuts to spending levels going forward.
I'm going to come back to that in a little bit in terms of the spending, what has been done under the Biden administration, what's to be expected. But Tim, I'm going to turn to you on this one. I'm going to get to talk a little bit about the EPA. Obviously, that is of utmost importance for our members from a regulatory standpoint, but they actually have a lot of activities going on. And somebody said in the conversation, obviously President Trump was there several years ago. They've learned some things. There's a new administration, new people that are there. what are we going to take, or what's the take from, the first administration to the second? What can we expect is going to change? And I know one of the questions that we have specifically, that was in the question on the Q&A was related to environmental justice. Already even last night, we heard that the D&I stuff within agencies, those folks are, ending those positions, those programs are related. So give a sense though about, EPA, where does it go? I mean, there's a lot that's there. There's lead pipe, PFAS, so forth and so on. But what's your
Yeah,
sense?
and let me start off, and Josh chime in. Josh has done so much work in the EPA space for a lot of years. So Josh, jump in and correct me. The way and I look at EPA to that question, Dean, it really starts with the president's incoming focus on energy generation and permitting reform and getting projects, big, beautiful projects going. And that impacts EPA. Kind of what is the role of the new, energy czar, as it were, and how does that relate to EPA? And I think it's through that lens of a drill, baby drill, to use the president's term, philosophy, that EPA is kind of subject to helping facilitate that. As far as beyond that, as far as the lead pipe replacement initiatives in the Biden years and the other initiatives, it kind of goes back to what we discussed earlier, is how far can the president go in executive orders to reverse what President Biden has done? And then what is the appetite in Congress to, take it further? So I think there is a strong feeling that I pick up from the incoming administration, you can sense, is that the EPA and the President's Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ is the term of art in DC, has gone way too far in slowing projects down and focused on the wrong things. So we're gonna push expedited projects and processes. And how that goes to water infrastructure and construction and programs, you could see, much less red tape potentially for projects. But that's one of the things, as part of the digestion, we have to look, because it will impact water infrastructure projects depending on how the permitting reform plays out. Josh, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to focus on.
Yeah, and Josh, if I could also interject, if you could,
Sure.
I want to hear your points of view, but also you work a lot with the Department of Energy too. So if you could hit sort of both of those.
Wow, double whammy.
Yes, you're up for it though.
Sorry,
Yeah.
brother.
So let me just pick up where Tim left on EPA, and then segue over to DOE, because there is going to be a measure that I think a policy imperative from the incoming administration that brings both of those agencies together. So one of the things that's happening certainly on drinking water standards, Tim alluded to this relating to lead, but also relating to PFAS, is we have national drinking water standards, new national drinking water standards for 6 PFAS compounds that was promulgated in the last administration as final. Now, those are applicable to obviously public water utilities of different sizes. And that particular final rule is still being litigated here in DC. The American Water Works Association brought litigation, a challenge to the rule based on cost and feasibility. On the other side, those same public water systems are trying to come into compliance with the lead and copper improvement rule that the Biden administration had promulgated, which works on top of the lead and copper rule update that the Trump administration and Trump 1 promulgated. And we've talked about, I think, on some prior webinars. And what's going on there, of course, is the lead lateral replacement. And while that is continuing to work, one of the aspects of the Biden administration's improvement rule was to accelerate the pace by which lead lateral service lines need to be replaced. It was at 20 years for big systems, 30 years for small. The improvement rule brought all of that forward to 10. And on top of that, said that the customer side also has to be replaced, and the water systems have to figure out how to finance that. Water systems are pushing back on that, not because it's not the right thing to do, it's just a cost and feasibility issue, and even trying to get their inventories right together. So there's that moving as well. And then bringing this, segueing over to the Department of Energy and where's the nexus, is that we saw in one of the president's executive orders on American energy, and of course the other announcement from the White House yesterday on AI and data center infrastructure. So one of the things, right, that data centers need is power, but the other thing they need is cooling. So where there is going to be a nexus to potentially permitting reform and expedited approvals, on the one hand, is going to be a working relationship by and between the federal government and states to do the data center infrastructure build out, but also potentially on water infrastructure as relates to those centers, but also as it relates to building new nuclear generation. Because whether it's AI data centers, EVs, and I know the current administration has a viewpoint on those, if you talk to our friends in both the electric generation and water utility business, one of the things that's central in all kind of strategy conversations right now is what do we do about water needs of these two very important infrastructure build outs. I would say that, you know, those are the things that kind of bring those two agencies together. In addition, this National Energy Council that U.S. Secretary Interior designee Doug Burgum, who is the Republican governor of North Dakota, will hopefully he'll be confirmed as the Interior Secretary, but he's also going to head up this National Energy Council. And water infrastructure for both energy as well as other needs in the country are going to come into that. And where DOE will also be spending more of its time is on LNG, export terminal, as well as grid related activities. So I want to bring this home to the water community to say that on the one hand, we're still going to need those innovative technologies that address drinking water, potable water quality, but we're also going to need technologies that address industrial water use. And whether that's for energy generation in the context of nuclear energy and cooling towers, or AI data, or AI data centers and their water related cooling needs, let alone just the bread and butter, right, of the water industry and water infrastructure in the United States, which is the broader infrastructure needs of distributing, treating, and distributing potable drinking water to all of us around the nation. So there's a lot of activity that those two agencies will be working on together that actually may have a beneficial impact in the water world, water community more broadly. And, you know, in addition to that will be how the new administration is also going to do business in terms of procurement. And also one of the areas I know, Dean, I'll just jump ahead because I think there's a nexus as well, and that's tariff policy, right? And again, we're still going back to our digestion characterization. And a lot of things that President Trump has said on the campaign trail, but also more recently, we're looking at that too, right? Because at the end of the day, broad-based tariffs on imported goods, and let's include in that technologies, right, that can be utilized in the provision of water, whatever end use that may be, could have an impact here, right? So you have to kind of figure out, is that something that'll be a potential impediment to doing business in the United States? Do I make further investments inside the United States to, you know, avoid tariffs amongst other things? And then I'll conclude here by saying, because we've talked about this, both you and I and Tim, in the context of these webinars, Buy America and Build America is going to be enforced, I would say, at a higher level than even the last administration, because it comports with the Trump administration's manufacturing and investment renewal, as well as the overarching tariff policy, right? So how this is going to effectuate itself, right, when we get to the blocking and tackling of rules and regulations, still TBD. But that also is a common thematic, at least that I'm hearing from folks that I'm talking to inside the administration.
Well, okay, we could cover this topics for the next 2 or 3 days, I would believe, because there's a bunch of things that are there.
Yeah.
The investment that was made on
Dean?
the, Jay,
If
go
I
ahead.
could just jump in on a couple
Absolutely.
things. I think, Josh really hit an important point on the AI data centers. I think that's going to be a huge focus over the next 4 years. And I noted that the executive order that Biden had put out a couple of weeks ago on addressing the energy needs for AI data centers was actually not included on that initial list of EO rescissions that Trump put out on day one. So potentially an area of a little more policy continuity than we've seen in a lot of other areas. The other thing I wanted to mention was just on the regulatory questions around EPA. I think generally across the board, there's going to be a strongly deregulatory agenda from the new administration, with EPA really at the center of that on a lot of the climate related regulations that they've put out there. I do think drinking water is going to be kind of interesting to watch, because we have this somewhat new direction from RFK Jr. and the Make America Healthy Again movement, that's bringing a little bit of a different perspective than we've seen in other Republican administrations when it comes to sort of food and water, and what are we putting in people's bodies. Obviously, RFK has been skeptical of a lot of mainstream medical advice on issues like fluoridation of water. But I think it's going to be interesting to see kind of how that melds into the rest of the Republican coalition on issues like EPA determinations on safe chemical levels in water. We might see kind of less of a chemical industry friendly approach than you would expect from a traditional Republican administration.
But I think, again, there has been it's great investment around the lead pipe infrastructure and removing that. But that was in many ways a drop in the bucket, I'd use a pun, Jay, in the whole infrastructure spending. And I mean, there was a lot that was there. And I think you all have pointed out that the needs and demands of the AI centers, the growth and expansion is significant. And so how do we build up? Because even as we're looking at energy to respond to AI is, they're looking at, nuclear and coal. I mean, not coal, but, other energy plants, that are going to go up fast, but it's the association with water. And you have to have that water infrastructure. But I want to sort of come back on the whole funding as a whole, billions of dollars that were out there. A lot has been spent. I suspect there's a lot that hasn't been spent. I know that there was a flurry of activity to get that out the door, but kind of generally, I'm just going to throw it out to the three of you who would want to comment. All that funding, it's of that level is not going to happen again, in the near future at all. But is there going to be funds that are going to be clawed back? What's the prospect of more funding for infrastructure going forward? Anybody want to? Tim?
Why don't I start, and obviously Josh, Jay, fill in the blanks. I think that the question of how much has gone out the door relative to what still is in the spend is something I think the Trump folks and the incoming Office of Management and Budget Director is trying to get a handle on. I think going forward, the issue is going to be what, quite frankly, the Republican governors who are the recipient of much of this money. It's not just blue states, but red states in our DC parlance. And how they react to money that potentially could be clawed back. So that is, I think, an open question as far as how those funds are going to be necessarily handled. I know, and Jay can get into more detail, one of the executive orders talked about stopping the infrastructure spending. I'm not, details to follow. So I think that some of the Republican side is trying to figure out how that will impact them. I would give one anecdote to that, and then turn over to Josh and Jay. You have a good Wisconsin nominee for the Department of Transportation. Sean Duffy is the nominee for the Department of Transportation. He indicated that the number one issue that had been raised in his pre-confirmation hearings, believe it or not, was around this whole question of sustainable aviation fuel and sustainability as far as the money that's going to ag states to promote sustainable aviation fuel. And the message was, yes, we want to roll back all that Biden did, but don't touch sustainable aviation fuel. So you get a lot of these yeah buts. And so and that was very bipartisan yeah buts. And Sean Duffy came back and said his takeaway was don't touch SAF. How does that matter to the White House officials, issuing these EOs? We don't know. So I think that kind of the pushback that may happen as they take money back potentially is going to have to play itself out through the system in this digestion process. So I don't know, John.
And related to that is that whole the idea of the Department of Government Efficiency, and that's even changed in this week as well, because there's a lot of questions of how does that go about. Josh, comments on all the funding. What's the prospects of that? Is it going to be are we seeing more reductions in the future as far as funding?
So I would say to pick up on where Tim was heading, just foundationally here. So we're in a regulatory pause right now. It's one of the overarching executive orders. And part and parcel of that is the Office of Management and Budget, amongst other agencies, heads, including the interim agency heads that have been appointed because we're still waiting for Senate confirmation of a number of cabinet secretaries. Everyone has to report back by the end of the month to OMB of funds that have not otherwise been, legal term here, obligated. Obligated is a fancy budget term and spending term, which means that I have received funds and they're being held in a government account for dispersal. And from a legal contracting perspective, they are reserved, so to speak. But I have not yet drawn down on them, and that is considered spending or funds that have been spent. So one of the things that the Biden administration did on the way out the door is obligated billions of dollars of funding across a lot of different agencies. And as Tim referenced, funding is going to almost every state in the union. And therefore, there are going to be some states like Wisconsin, but I'll pick one of our other states that we work a lot in at A.O. Smith, Tennessee, which is per capita one of the largest recipients of infrastructure spending, other federal spending on batteries, and you name it. So to Tim's, but thematic here, I think there is going to be, or rather there will be, governors and members of Congress that will hold up their hands and say there's a lot of economic development activity that's happening as a result of those funds. So let's use a scalpel and not an axe here, Trump administration. And I think that's going to find its way into the congressional process as well, and tax policy that Jay is very fluent on. And I'll conclude here as far as future spending. I would say, Dean, just bigger picture, and criticism and pro and con notwithstanding, from a policy perspective, over the next 2 years, let alone the next 4, you're not going to see the amount of money that was authorized and spent than you saw in the previous 4 years under the Biden administration. Again, putting politics out of it for a moment, just the level of spending is not going to happen again. I suspect that maybe not for another generation, because there are a lot of fiscal issues that need to be addressed as far as the fiscal condition in the United States that both Democrats and Republicans actually want to work on. Hence, what you'll see moving forward, notwithstanding the remaining dollars that were, otherwise obligated in the bipartisan infrastructure law, in the IRA, and all the rest of that, is going to be the normal, I can't believe I'm saying it, but the normal federal spending appropriations process, using your pun, a drop in the bucket, for a lot of things. But that's what we're going to see moving forward, and with the potential, emphasis on word potential, for some of that spending to be reduced in Washington speak, at a rate that would help with getting the fiscal house in order. So that's kind of my outlook on current and future spending.
Real quickly, congressionally directed funding. This is self-interest, called earmarks. Do you see that going forward at all in the future? Yes, no answer on that.
Tim
Smiles.
and Jay.
I was going to defer to Jay since his guys are in charge, so they're going to have to make some decisions here.
My sense is likely yes, because when the House Republican Conference voted on this at the beginning of 2023, I believe it was something like 150 to 50 was the vote in favor of keeping congressionally directed spending in place. The Senate Republicans have actually been more skeptical on this than the House Republicans in recent years. But the flip side of that is that the Senate will also need to get 60 votes for appropriations bills. And so they're going to have to work out some agreement with the Democratic side on this. My gut says congressionally directed spending survives, but that there are probably some limitations relative to what's been the practice for the last few years.
In the bottom line, and this has sort of been talked about in infrastructure, but also this is all about getting money into home districts and home states. And that's a Republican and a Democratic interest, is like, how do I take care of my constituents as well? We've got probably a little over 10 minutes or so. I want to turn to international, because we do have a lot of folks that are on that are from other places. Obviously, a lot of talk about tariffs. But Josh, you brought up about the Buy America, Build America Act. I'll start with that. Tim and Jay, any thoughts that you have, building on what Josh had to say about the Buy America, Build America?
Why don't I start and then Jay jump in? I think, Josh was exactly right. That kind of the frame for corporations that I kind of see is, the last 4 years, the Biden administration was very heavy-handed, prescriptive on regulations as far as what companies should be doing, et cetera. Whether you think that's right or wrong, it was a very directive. Now we're in a situation where it's a much more pro-business environment generally with the Trump administration, I would argue. But to a key point that Josh raised at the beginning, I think the administration, you see it in the AI data center announcement, other announcements, it's a question of, bring the jobs back to the United States. That is, the tariff issue. Tariffs weren't part of the day one executive orders. The potential for tariffs on Canada, Mexico, China, the president now talking about a February 1st deadline. You're looking at that as a kind of a leverage play to push those countries in a certain direction that the president wants them to go. But I kind of look at it as if you're investing in the United States, this is a very transactional group, I think is our history. You're going to get a lot of visibility. And so it's not all companies, corporate America is great. It's what is corporate America doing to invest in the United States, put America first, and obviously then that makes the administration look good. So it's not a one size fits all. It depends on the operation. But I do think even more than whatever the President Biden did as far as Buy America, I agree with Josh. You just double it. I mean, that is the focus that these folks have coming in, and we'll see it play out on the tariff front. But I think we're on second base on tariffs. Before we get home, to use a baseball analogy, I think that's ongoing, at least for the next month, with the countries I just named.
Okay, thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think we're in what I would describe as a bipartisan protectionist moment right now. There is a lot of skepticism about the U.S.-China trade relationship on both sides of the aisle. I saw there was a question in the chat about the U.S. steel purchase by Nippon Steel. Weirdly, one of the things that Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and approximately 0 economists agree on is blocking that sale. So I do think you will see in many ways a continuation of the policy direction that began in the first Trump administration, continued in the Biden administration, and will continue to move forward on, Buy America, imposing tariffs, particularly on China. I think a couple of areas of nuance that I would highlight on the international side. I think you will see more of a focus from the Trump administration on promoting American exports and American investment abroad. There was a comment in the trade executive order about opening overseas markets for American products, which has been a very vocal frustration by Republican members of Congress with the outgoing administration, that there wasn't any sort of focus on free trade agreements and opening overseas markets. And the other thing I would flag is this, there's been some reporting about Trump's interest in creating some sort of U.S. equivalent of a sovereign wealth fund, potentially through the Development Finance Corporation, which was established in his first term, that would kind of draw in more private sector American capital into financing global infrastructure projects. Kind of deep to your earlier question about funding for infrastructure, I think Trump has always been very interested in this concept of public-private partnerships and trying to draw in private capital to infrastructure investment. And I think you'll see that on the international stage as well.
So, go ahead, Tim.
Another point, Dean, real quick. I think that one of the focuses throughout the campaign, and you may have another yeah, but moment as this plays out, is on the issue of immigration. You have a situation, obviously the headline is about mass deportations, et cetera, but you also have discussions about H-1B visas, other visas, and you will likely see, if this plays out, a tightening labor market if you really restrict immigration. And you'll have some of corporate America saying, no, wait a minute, we didn't mean us. Dial that back. And I think that if you have a tightening labor market, tariffs, you could see prices going back up, and obviously inflation was a major issue coming out of the pandemic. And it'll be interesting to see how the Trump administration handles that dynamic, because if I would think most economists would say you tighten the labor market and you slap on tariffs, you're gonna have some macroeconomic impacts. But we'll see. But I think immigration is a major focus, and increasingly so, of corporate America.
Just to pick up another pun, there's a lot of ripple effects into all these decisions that are going on. Josh, can we talk a little bit about tariffs as well? And I know that, there's been a lot of discussions about China and of course, Canada, Mexico. Um, but where did tariffs sort of fall into all of this discussions? And I think that is, and I think Tim sort of talked about evolving, even over the last few days. Um, do we see things that are happening in Europe with respect to tariffs? How is this going to impact, utilities that are going to be purchasing things, industries, what's that sense around, again, the tariff question?
Sure. So on tariffs, right? There's going to be an order of things this time around, and just kind of to level set. So the tariffs that were carried over from the first Trump administration and then extended by the Biden administration were more sector specific. There were foundational investigations under the trade laws and trade acts that were done for the different sections, 301 for most other products, 232 for aluminum, steel, et cetera. Those tariffs are still in place, and they're very easily, President Trump can really at any point make an announcement to put those back on or escalate them because the underlying investigations have already been done. That said, I do think from the executive order that we saw on, I would just, for the sake of our discussion, tariff policy, it appears as though what he would like to do is have a process by which he can be informed and the trade team can be informed on what additional measures, if any, and at what rates and on what scope of products could be considered here. The backstory, of course, on this, and especially all of the oxygen, so to speak, being used with China, Mexico, and Canada are twofold. In the first instance, with China, our bilateral relationship, not at best right now, but it's a symbiotic one. Whether we like that or not, it is. There's the backdrop of what's going on with TikTok, not necessarily relevant to the water sector per se, but it's informing what the administration and really what President Trump may or may want to do with President Xi and China. Canada and Mexico, this is really more so about two domestic issues: energy, Canadian energy coming, right, and immigration at the southern border, but also the USMCA is up for renewal.
Can you
And
say what that is?
sorry, the United States Mexico Canada agreement is the successor of NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, for those of us who were old enough to remember that being promulgated. And that's up for renewal. And President Trump definitely has some agenda items on the renegotiation relating to national security, border, immigration policy, energy policy, some constitutional reforms that happened in Mexico that I think his team does not like, amongst other things. So what does all that mean? What that means is we more likely than not are going to see some new tariffs put in place this calendar year. It's more so going to be scope and size, and whether or not, similar to the first Trump administration, there is an exemption process put in place to avoid the new tariff. We are hoping, certainly as a product manufacturer that does business all across North America and the world, that some agreements will be put in place by and between the Sheinbaum administration in Mexico and the Trump administration. And of course, as you know, north of the border, there will be an election. And Justin Trudeau is Prime Minister Trudeau is on the way out, Liberal Party on the way out. There will be a new government there that I think President Trump will get to talk to and negotiate with. So that there's a more business certainty moving forward. And I'll conclude here by saying a lot of the talk and the rhetoric, right, is I think President Trump, although he has not said this directly, I don't want to attribute this to him per se, but there are folks close to him that understand that if the administration goes too hard, too fast on broad-based tariffs just across the entire economy, that will have an inflationary impact. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And the one thing that President Trump does not want to do is have his policies associated almost immediately with a rise in inflation. So I think there'll be some moderation in that regard. We're going to have to wait and see how this plays out.
Great. We're at the top of the hour, everyone, but I'm gonna, Jay, give me 10 seconds because I want to finish off by sort of what we started off is, what's your sense 2026, the next election? What's the tea leaves?
I mean, I think the historical record would say that Democrats are pretty heavily favored to retake the House of Representatives in 2026. They're only going to need to pick up about 3 seats. Midterm elections tend to be pretty negative to the president's party. I think there's been like 1 or 2 exceptions to that in the last 50 years. So if you're Hakeem Jeffries, you're probably going to be measuring the drapes in the speaker's office in about 18 months here. I think the Senate is going to be much more challenging for Democrats. They have, you know, 1 target in a blue state, Susan Collins in Maine. They have Tom Tillis in North Carolina. That's going to be a competitive race. But beyond that, it starts to become really hard to see where their pickup opportunities are. And Republicans are going to be on the offense in Georgia, particularly with John Ossoff up for his first re-election there. So I think you kind of start out, obviously, needless to say, very, very early to make any prognostications, but I think you would say Democrats are favored to take the House, Republicans are favored to hold their majority in the Senate.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Josh, Tim, Jay, thank you very much for all the time. I know we could have spent a lot more on many of these different topics. So we'll have to come back and do this again in the near future, but I appreciate the time and appreciate everybody listening in and participating as well. Thank you, Josh, Tim.
Absolutely.
Any final comments? Nope.
I would say this, the only final comment from my perspective, certainly the product manufacturer and looking at it from that through that corporate lens, there is going to be opportunity in the water space for innovation technology, for procurement, a lot of opportunities. We're just going to have to navigate a little differently. So certainly want to end on an optimistic tone.
Yeah.
You know, there's no way you got to have water and you got to deal with the waste
That's right.
as well.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Exactly right.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.